Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm joined by Dr. Jeroen Hopster. He was a postdoctoral researcher at Utrecht University in the Netherlands and now he is doing research on climate ethics at University of Graz in Austria. In February 2019 he defended his dissertation, Moral Objectivity, Origins and Foundations, and now he works on topics like climate ethics, uncertainty, philosophy of technology and others. So Dr. Hopster, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's entirely my pleasure, and I'm humbled that you put me on the same channel with the many great thinkers you've interviewed here. So many thanks.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love your research topics, so that's one of the reasons why I invited you on. Okay, so let's start with morality and moral realism, because that's one of the topics you were previously interested in, and you did some research on that. So, I mean, this is a very complicated topic. I've already talked about it with different philosophers on the show, and different people have different positions, different opinions. So, I mean, for something to be morally realistic, what would you say are the criteria that it would have to fulfill?
Right, so I agree with you. It is a bit of a sort of technical question, and it is a complicated topic, and much depends on how you conceptualize the exact terms we're talking about. So moral realism, as I understand it, and as I think that in the philosophical community it's generally understood, is a position about the nature of morality, and it's a position that I think that the sort of essential clauses are the following. First, there are moral truths. Moral truths exist. Second, these moral truths can be known. We can have sort of epistemic access to these truths. Thirdly, the moral truths are objective. And I think a crucial added clause that I would, my conception of moral realism, is that objectivity should be understood in terms of mind independence. Right? So what does it mean? So let me try to give you an example. So we're currently amidst of the COVID-19 situation. What might be a moral truth about COVID-19? Well, for example, one might make a judgment endangering the health of the population when you could easily avoid doing so is morally bad, right? That's a moral judgment, and it might be, arguably, it's a moral truth. A realist would say, well, this is a truth. It's a noble truth. We can track it. We can find out about it. It doesn't stay hidden from us. It's a truth that applies categorically to anybody. So it's not just my truth, but it's not a personal truth. It's not a function of what any particular individual happens to think about it, or not even the function of a sort of procedure that we have taken on to endorse this truth. It's a truth that's independent from our attitudes. And that brings us to the sort of positive claim of realists, namely moral judgments. They correspond to a mind-independent reality. So there's an independent, objective, mind-independent reality of moral truths and or moral judgments. If they are true, they correspond to this reality. So that's the underlying idea of moral realism. There's an independent moral reality which is independent of what people think or feel or agree about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and when we get into things like evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, I mean, we know now that our minds are also products of evolution and the evolutionary pressures that we were under during our evolutionary history and things like that. So then it gets even more complicated, because we know that it is through our evaluative mechanisms or our mechanisms of valuation that we evolved, that we basically make moral judgments, and we have our morality. I mean, our morality is also an evolved feature of our minds as well as in other animals, right? So when we add that to the picture, what are the sorts of problems that arrive?
Right. So I think there might be sort of two views you might take about this? What are the implications of our evolutionary understanding of morality for the status of ethics, so to say? Yeah. And I think one view to take on it is not quite the right view, and one is a better view. So let me first try to spell out what view I don't think is the right view to take on it. I think this is a view, for example, endorsed by Michael Ruse, whom you've always also had on this podcast, which is that by the light of our evolutionary understanding of the nature of morality, there is no such thing as objective morality. So objective morality is debunked. So I think, to simplify a little bit, I think Michael Ruse's argument would be what we call moral judgments. They are, in a way, simply or evolved impulses to cooperate that our genes have placed on us. And I mean, these can be explained in evolutionary terms, and so can our appearance that morality is objective. And given that all of this can be explained in evolutionary terms, there really is no need to posit this existence of an independent realm of moral truth, right? We can simply have their evolutionary explanation, and this meta-ethical postulate, so to say, is redundant. There's no need to posit that. So there is no objective morality. So to simplify a little bit, this will be Michael Ruse's argument. And I think that argument is not entirely convincing. I think it's too scientific in a way. It relies too much on the evolutionary side of the explanation and too little on the meta-ethical side of it. So for example, if you compare this to mathematical truths, the truth of +2 = 4. Now let's say that our capacity to do mathematics can be explained in evolutionary terms. Does that mean that 2 + 2 = 4 is no longer a mathematical truth? That doesn't seem to follow. It seems to be the case that you can explain certain capacities, outcomes in evolutionary terms, but still also think of them as independent truths, right? Or the one need not undermine the other. So I think that's not the right way to go about it. What I think is the right way to go about it is to sort of nuance the way in which we conceive or conceptualize objectivity. So as I just sketched, there's this notion of moral realism, which adheres to this very strong sense of objectivism, namely of a fully independent, mind-independent realm of moral truths. Well, I think that this sort of very strong objectivity is probably undermined by evolutionary explanations, because we might still think of moral truths as objective, but we should reconceptualize objectivity. So it can't be the case that objective means that it's fully independent from our attitudes. We have to find a sort of more attitude-dependent conception of objectivity. So, the basic problem, as I see it, for moral realism in the face of evolution, or maybe it's even a more general sort of problem for realists, is that there must be some way in which we connect to these independent moral truths, right? There's this independent realm of moral truths, and we seem to have access to them, right? We have sort of tracked these moral truths over the course of history or of evolution, but how do we have this access? There must be some sort of connection between our moral beliefs and the moral truths. And if there's no such connection, then it seems a mere coincidence that our moral beliefs are correct, if they are correct. So one way in which realists might sort of respond to this challenge is to say, well, the moral truths, this independent domain of moral truths, have exerted a sort of pressure on our beliefs. So our beliefs have been formed in accordance with the moral truths. We have discovered these moral truths throughout history, throughout evolution. And I think this is sort of the moment where the science comes into philosophy, because this commits realists to a scientific hypothesis, namely that indeed during history or during evolution, there has been this sort of truth-tracking process occurring. And I mean, that's something that can be tested or that can be assessed, whether there's any evidence in favor or against it. So I think that by the light of this scientific hypothesis, I think that the moral realist position is not that plausible, because the evidence, if we indeed start to look at evolution and at our moral history, is not that we have had these sort of sudden flashes of insight where we traced some mind-independent truths. I mean, how we conceive of how moral truths are sort of come in society, that's a very different process of deliberation and of experimentation. We can talk more about it, but it's not the sort of, I mean, I don't think that the actual evidence corroborates the moral realist hypothesis in this respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but at a certain point there you refer to, for example, mathematical truths, 2 + 2 = 4, and things like that, that at least we consider to be independent from a subject or from some subjective evaluation or something like that. So, would you agree with some moral realists when they say that, for example, by trying to force some sort of metaphysical status on moral truths, like, for example, that we have to be sure that they are independent from subjectivity, that they are objective in some sort of way, that we are not really being fair with the sort of question that we are trying to tackle here, because, I mean, moral truths are metaphysically distinct from, for example, scientific truths, let's call them, like, for example, finding that there's atoms out there and how they work and how they interact with each other, and I mean, biological systems and things like that. I mean, you can't really use a microscope to find, or a telescope to find moral truths out there, right? So does this metaphysical distinction make some sort of difference here? I mean, when it comes to understanding what objectivity means in these two different realms?
Yes, I think that's a very legitimate point, and I would endorse that point. And I think that to the extent that moral realists indeed make that claim, I think they're correct about it. So I think that each sort of metaphysical domain, so to say, might have its own sort of epistemology, the way we arrive at certain truths and the way that we understand what truths are or what objectivity is. But I think that, in fact, realists are misled in this respect. Because what they do is model the moral domain very much like the scientific domain. And the way they conceive of moral truths is very much as like scientists conceive of scientific truths, as being mind-independent, objective. And I think if you actually look at the moral domain and study it in more detail, it's not quite correct to conceive of it this way. And I think moral truths have much more of human nature, human needs, preferences, attitudes ingrained in them. And I think that's a more fertile way to approach the matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, let's say that people made this distinction really straight away between the metaphysical status of moral truths and or the epistemological status as well of moral truths and the other kinds of truth, whatever you want to call it. So do you think that there would be any way by which morality could be objective, even if we had to change what we mean by objectivity in that case?
Yes, I do think that there is a way in which morality can be regarded as objective. So the kind of objectivity that I reject is mind-independent reality. We've tracked this sort of mind-independent reality. No, that's not the case. If you look at evolutionary history, human history, evidence from anthropology, etc., you see that there's been a sort of, if we talk about metaphors, you might think the metaphor of realism is the metaphor of discovery. We have discovered truths that are independent from us. And I think a much more suitable metaphor to think what has, or to portray what's actually been going on throughout history is a metaphor of experimentation and exploration. So it's not that we've traced this mind-independent reality, we've been exploring sort of what works well for society, right? So in sort of small tribes of human beings, there were certain, things that worked well for the community, things that fostered social cooperation, things that didn't go well for social cooperation. And then through processes of trial and error, we stumbled up on what worked better for societies and worse. And then at a certain point, human societies became literate, and we started to sort of explicitly reflect on the norms we endorse. Right? And this has become an increasingly more intricate process of reflecting on our habits or norms or values. We've made certain institutions which also institutionalize what's right and wrong to do, which also institutionalize reflection on that, which institutionalize societal deliberation. And I think that's really the sort of history we have to be looking at. So if you think, for example, nowadays, one of the most important institutions is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's one of the most important moral institutions, which really has ingrained in them the sort of essential rights that we as humanity endorse. I mean, is this a document that has been discovered from a mind-independent reality? That's of course a straw man, or a bit of an exaggeration. But I mean, clearly it's not the case. It was a response to a specific historical event, namely the Second World War, which made us think we had never again, and we have to, build a new society and collective institutions to ensure that this will never happen again. And I think that's a good model for what's happened throughout history, namely that we've learned from our past mistakes, we've started to reflect on them, and on the basis of that, we have engaged in this sort of trial and error process where things have been incrementally increasing and turning for the better. So if you think, so that brings me back to the question, what is moral objectivity from this sort of perspective? Well, I mean, to say that moral truth is objective might be to claim that it's a moral judgment which has been reflected upon for a long time, which has been scrutinized in many different contexts, societies, by many different people from many different standpoints, and it has withstood all this scrutiny, right? So, I mean, it's something that we've reflected about, and it's a certain judgment about society. How do we foster cooperation? What is good for us? How can we enhance human flourishing? It's a sort of judgment in this ballpark, and it has withstood the test of time. We have figured out through all these practices and deliberation that this is indeed right, a sort of fixed point of the moral domain. So I think that's the kind of notion of objectivity that I would be willing to endorse, and that I think we should endorse and we should sort of keep with us, and which is very important. So it's not objectivity as a discovery of something mind independent, but it's objectivity in the sense of having explored, having tried out, and having stumbled upon what works well for us.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, the idea that you've just put forth, because in a way, wouldn't you agree that we could say that by going through that, let's say, game theory process where different societies experiment with different approaches, and then the ones that don't work, basically those societies are not successful, and those practices and habits and so on do not endure over time? I mean, because we are pitting basically our ideas and practices against reality, I mean, we get some feedback from reality as well. So, I mean, in a way, we have a little bit of realism there, because we are basically testing out our practices, institutions, and norms, and so on, against reality itself. It's not that we are simulating things in some sort of computer simulation and working them out to see then what would work. So would you agree that we could call that bit at least realism, or not?
Right. I mean, I'm sympathetic to your observation. So, I mean, I would be fine to calling this a species of realism. I mean, I think that the sort of the technical way in which the moral realism debate is framed in the philosophical literature often hinges towards this stronger notion of realism, where realism is really about this mind-independent reality. And that's the kind of realism that I think is untenable in evolutionary terms. But I mean, yes, there's a lot of realism in a broader sense, like you are pointing towards, to this position as well. And I mean, the point is that there's always some element of human attitude, human reflection to what are moral truths or not. It's not that we simply arrive at the moral truth by discovery. I mean, it really depends on how we ourselves relate to this truth, how we reflect on it, right? So without this sort of relating human being, or at least this relating agent, there cannot be such thing as a moral objective, moral truth, I think. But that said, I do think that there's indeed a lot of sort of realism, and I mean, not everything works. So I mean, one sort of label that is used for the position I'm articulating in the literature is sometimes constructivism. But one of the sort of tricky things about this label, I think, is that constructivism might be taken to apply that, you know, that construction is a more or less arbitrary process, and that it might have gone in either direction. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, there are certain constraints to what will work well in human societies, given the kind of creatures we are, and given the kind of conditions in which we find ourselves. So there's a lot of reality to check, so to say, or moral judgments, and I think that's exactly the same thing that you're hinting towards. So yeah, and I endorse that view as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, and let's say when people perform some sort of moral psychology experiments in the lab or in natural environments or something like that, what would you say is the relevance of the knowledge that we obtain from that to moral philosophy? I mean, do you think that by knowing how people's moral intuitions work, or knowing a little bit more about our folk morality, let's say, that we need to change or to adapt the ways by which we approach or tackle these moral problems?
Right, that's a very interesting question. So I think that one of the key arguments that has been historically advanced by moral realism does, at least implicitly, rely on ordinary moral experience. So realists have often argued, like, why is moral discourse objective? Why do we endorse its thesis about the mind-independent reality, moral reality? Well, because moral claims do seem to be very demanding, seem to be very objective, seem to be very authoritative, right? So there seems to be this, there's this sort of phenomenology of objectivity, or this sort of moral experience of objectivity. But the problem is, this is an assertion that has basically been made from the armchair, at least during the 20th century, without proper investigation by experimental psychologists, looking population-wide, or like, is this like an intuition that one specific moral realist or metaethicist has, or is this an intuition endorsed by the population? So I think one way in which experimentally testing people's intuitions about moral objectivity can be relevant for this debate is to test whether this claim by realists, whether morality is indeed generally experienced as being very strongly objective, authority independent, very demanding, whether this sort of strong objectivity is indeed shared by the rest of the population. And I've looked a little bit into these studies. They have their own sort of pitfalls and problems, so it's not that easy actually to test metaethical notions, which are very sort of intricate concepts. In a survey, in a research survey. But still, I think the results do count for something. And what you actually see from the research that has been undertaken over the last 2 decades that has really come up is that there's a much more variety than moral realists first claim there to be. So there is this intuition that the moral domain is more objective, for example, than the domain of taste, right? So it's not, moral judgments are not purely subjective. But it doesn't seem to be quite as objective as the domain of fact. And most interestingly, there seems to be a major variety. So certain issues, certain moral issues will be regarded as highly objective, whereas others are not. Right? There might also be individual variance between people. So one person might be more of an objectivist, whereas others might be more of a subjectivist. So to say from the armchair, well, experience moral demands as highly objective, that's not an experience that has been corroborated by actual studies. So in this way, I think that experimental studies might also be able to debunk, or at least challenge arrived views articulated in this instance by moral realists.
Oh, that's very interesting. So there are really studies out there that point toward individual variation in terms of being more or less inclined toward moral objectivity or moral subjectivity. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, and it might depend on issues. So, like some person might regard an issue regarding same-sex marriage as an objective issue, but euthanasia as an objective issue, right? So, whereas these would both ordinarily be classified as belong to the moral domain. So there's a lot of variation there, and I mean, and this is really a field that's just opening up, and there's, of course, it raises many questions. Why is there this variation, right? So what can explain that? And there are different hypotheses around there. So much more work to be done, but at least this shows that at least this sort of very generic observation, like moral demands are very objective. I mean, that doesn't seem to really be corroborated in that simple sense.
Mhm. So we are still not sure if it has some sort of genetic element, or if it is completely influenced by the environment people are raised up in, or they live in, or some sort of thing like that, right?
No, I mean that's a further question. So I mean that also might depend on the issue. I mean there might be certain issues that are really sort of tied to our biological needs, and that therefore might be perfectly explicable mostly in biological terms. But I mean, biology, of course, has this sort of element of genetic coding, let's say, but also a big element of cultural flexibility. So how we express our sort of biological material, well, that depends really on the environments in which we find ourselves. And I think that's true for a lot of moral judgments. We are sort of certain proclivities, so we might easily endorse a certain set of norms, but whether we actually do will depend also on the sort of cultural environment in which we find ourselves. And I think this is a sort of important insight also, not just from for theorizing about the nature of morality, but also for moral, for normative debate itself, or for policymakers, namely that the sort of conditions we create, the cultural conditions, they will shape our biological repertoire. Right? So I mean, how we express our biological repertoire will really much depend on the conditions in which we find ourselves. I think there's
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk now about some very specific topics in moral philosophy. So recently you've got interested in things like climate ethics, right? So how do you approach this type of question with that in mind, with things in mind, like, for example, that morality is probably not objective and there's no moral realism out there in any sort of way? So first of all, maybe what do you think are some of the most pressing and important questions nowadays surrounding climate ethics, and how do you tackle them?
right. Well, I mean, climate ethics is a very big field, and there are many different questions to be raised. I mean, some of the key questions concern, for example, intergenerational justice. So many of the risks that come about with climate change, with global warming, will be risks that, well, they are risks for present generation, but it will be much bigger risks for future generations. So how we deal with global warming from an ethical point of view is also a sort of risk allocation problem. Where do we allocate the risks? Do we sort of spread them equally around over generations, or do we place all the big risks on future generations? So I mean that's one side to it. There's also my specific research topic in the field of climate ethics, which I'm currently taking on, is about uncertainty. A lot of science about climate change is, in spite of contrarians, is very well established and has been progressing over decades now. But that said, there is still scientific uncertainty. There's also uncertainty about many other relevant variables, especially if we think about the further future, what will happen in 2100 when IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, They make projections about what will happen to the global average temperature up until 2100. Well, I mean, that's very far ahead. There will be model uncertainty, so uncertainty about what the models bring and how we should interpret these results, but there's uncertainty about how human society will develop technologically. There's uncertainty about the kind of leaders that we will choose and which sort of climate policy they will endorse. So there are many different kinds of uncertainty that play here, and this makes climate change, and especially from a moral point of view, it makes it a question of how we deal with this uncertainty, how we handle it. So that's like the sort of entry point for, and I'm currently taking into this debate. And of course, these are questions that are relevant to climate change, but they're relevant to many other matters as well. So, for example, right now we're in this COVID-19 crisis. We have certain fixed points, certain knowledge we do have, and we know what is right to do and what is wrong to do. But there's also a large margin of uncertainty. How do we deal with it? How do we cope with that? And I think right now we are experiencing sort of an interesting dress rehearsal for what might occur in the further future when we cannot count on the normal status quo, and when there will be disruptive events occurring more and more frequently, and what exactly this disruption will entail, that's difficult to say. But at least in the current event, disruption gets a face for us, and I think that's the sort of future that we might be heading towards if we don't take proper care about our climate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting that you also mentioned COVID-19 because at the moment there are many people quarantined at home and in hospital. So it's interesting because one of the effects that this is having, at least for now, is that our carbon dioxide emissions are going down, right? So that's also another way to connect the two topics. And I mean, you mentioned uncertainty, and how do you tackle those sorts of issues? I mean, you posed some of the main questions that we have on the table right now. I mean, we have to think about how climate change will progress over time and the sort of political measures that we have to put into practice and how things will be in decades or in 100 years or something like that. So is there any way for us, I mean, any criteria or approach that we can use to really make the best decisions that we can with the information that we have?
Right. Yeah. So one sort of approach I'm interested in is in conceptualizing and thinking about the epistemology of real possibilities, as we might call it. Mm-hmm. So if in making predictions about what might happen in the future or making certain risk assessments, people often think in terms of probabilities, right? A risk might be conceptualized as a negative outcome times the probability that this negative outcome will occur. But I mean, oftentimes probabilities, especially if you think about the further future, are not that helpful because we really have to. The probabilities themselves are uncertain. We can't rely on them. Right? There are many two known unknowns as well as unknown unknowns. So we can't simply rely on them. So we have to maybe think also in terms of different concepts. We have to conceptualize this sort of uncertainty, which is not quite ignorance. We do know something. We have some relevant evidence, but it's too muddled and sufficiently unclear to really attach a clear probability on. So I think that this sort of realm of uncertainty, just above the level of ignorance, but below the level of clear probabilities, that's an interesting field to conceptualize in further detail because that hasn't been done that well yet, I think. And so one notion we might focus on are real possibilities. Scientists often think in terms of real possibilities. So I mean the possibility of a certain part of the Antarctic's melting in 2050 is regarded as a real possibility. But what does it mean to say that this is a real possibility? And I think that one interesting contribution a philosopher might make is to really look at the sort of epistemology of real possibility. So, for example, what might be a good epistemological basis to make these sort of assessments. And some relevant criteria there might be the diversity of the sources of evidence. So does the evidence that this event is going to occur, does it come from one source or does it come from many sources? Is there consensus among the experts? And how did this consensus come about? Is it simply a consensus because one hears the story from the other and accepts this and endorses it? Or is it really a critical consensus that has come about through a sort of contestation of ideas? So there are these many sort of ways in which ideas come about, which can tell us about how we should epistemically assess certain evidence, right? And I think that there's much more interesting work to be done in getting these criteria clear and in finding out how we should judge real possibilities, whether one possibility is more real than the other, and on which basis we might take this to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I also guess that there is a mix of topics going there, because when we talk, for example, about climate change, it's not the case that we only have to worry about the impact that our activities are having on the environment. We also have to care about the economy and things like that, because, for example, people could say, okay, we will increase a lot our carbon taxes, but if that has a big toll on companies and things like that, then people might lose their jobs, and then we might have other sorts of problems like poverty and things like that. So, I mean, it is not the case that when we talk about climate change, it's an isolated topic, and even more so in this complex world that we live in, right?
Absolutely. And I think there are no win-win situations. There are trade-offs all the time. And I probably wouldn't be in favor of acting too disruptively, because you notice at present what's happening when there's very disruptive social change. All of a sudden, people are no longer to go outside or go to their work, etc. And many people don't get customers anymore, and this brings severe economic harm, of course. And I mean, I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad policy. It might be justified given the circumstances, but still there's a trade-off there, and so we should keep on thinking whether this trade-off is justified all the time. And it's I think in the climate case it's very similar. But I mean, that said, so it's not a win-win situation, but still we can try to move towards to make progress and to make incremental steps for improvement. And I think that's the way we should try to go about it. So first, we should become very clear-headed about what we want to achieve, what the values are we want to act upon, what kind of future we want to establish, how we want to allocate these risks, and what sort of policies might be instrumental in realizing this. And I mean, and so the example you mentioned, like right now, there's less air pollution, and climate-wise, this might indeed be like a comparatively good period. And I mean, that's of course a bit cynical in a way, because there are many more greater harms occurring. But I do think, I mean, this is a period when all the sort of normal routines have been cancelled and everything is different. And that's a very good period to reflect upon, like, okay, well, if life is gonna pick up speed again, are we reverting to a sort of back to normal business as usual situation, or are we going to try to implement certain changes? And I mean, if there's ever a moment for change, crises are the moment, and this is a very good crisis because it affects everybody and it affects human behavior as well as institutions. So I think this would be a very good moment to really reflect on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also more so because I think that we also got a little bit lucky, because even if this pandemic is serious and is affecting lots of lives out there, it still only kills less than 1% of infected people. If it was something like the bubonic plague that killed around 90% of people, then that would be really messed up and we would be in really big trouble and a lot of people would die really. So I guess that we also have a chance now to learn how to deal better also at an international level with pandemics, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's you're entirely right, and it's not excluded the possibility that a much worse sort of pandemia might occur at some point during our lifetimes. So indeed, I mean, I hope that we will remember the lessons from this episode. I mean, I hope that it will, in a way, I hope it will end as quickly as possible. I mean, of course, but I hope we won't forget what we learned from it. And that brings us back, by the way, to our previous discussion or my previous comment about you know, acquiring moral knowledge is really a process of societal learning. We learn how to cope with certain challenges, situations. We find solutions for problems. And this is really a sort of new problem in contemporary society we're now dealing with. And we're trying to cope with it. We're trying to find solutions. And we're definitely not doing perfectly. And hopefully we'll do it a little bit better next time. And that's really what moral progress consists of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk just about one last topic, and going back also to evolution and evolutionary ethics, I guess. There's a big topic in today's society that is how we should deal or treat other animals. I mean, other sentient beings, for example, because there are animals that are on the margins in terms of sentience, and we are really not sure if they have some specific kinds of mental experiences, like for example bivalves and other animals like that. They don't seem to have any sort of consciousness, or they don't feel pain and things like that. So there's one way to frame this debate. Some people call it the speciesism debate, right? Because in a way we are speciesist, right? We don't tend to include other animals in our moral circle, as Peter Singer would say, for example. And what would you say are some of the most important questions that we have to deal with surrounding that big topic?
Right. Well, with regard to speciesism, so I mean, I think Peter Singer, his work and what he has done for society as well is great. And I think especially with regard to factory farming, that's really a huge blind spot still in human practices. But speciesism, so if you look at the concept in more detail, it raises certain questions. So speciesism is often conceptualized as the preferential consideration of members of one's own species compared to other species. And this is comparable, for example, to racism or to sexism. It's really a matter of bias. We favor members of our own species as opposed to the others. And the underlying principle there is a principle of equal consideration of interests. So we should weigh the interests of members of different species equally. Right. Well, I mean, there's much to be said for that, of course, and I think I generally endorse that principle. We should give equal considerations to equal interests, but I mean, a lot does hinge on what are equal interests. When are interests sufficiently alike to give them equal consideration? Because arguably, if you're looking at interests within the human species, okay, well then it's not that difficult to make such assessments. But if you look at interests of members of different animal species, then it's very, very difficult to make the assessments of when are their interests comparable, right? What are comparable interests? Take a turtle, which is a solitary creature which lays its eggs on the beach and then swims off and never sees its offspring again, versus human beings, which are very invested in parenting. What does it mean to have an interest in not losing your offspring? Well, for a human, that means something completely different compared to a turtle, right? Just because of our biology. So, can you really say that these interests are alike in any way? And that seems to be very complicated. And so we run into these sort of complications. What does it mean to say that the interests are alike? And I think this is the underlying principle of speciesism, this principle of equal consideration of interests. And I think that in the end, speciesism, even if it's a correct sort of critique on human practices, I think it might have a somewhat limited application, because often it's very difficult to compare the interests of different animals. And well, so what will be involved in comparing these interests in more detail? A lot of science, a lot of empirical work, a lot of phenomenological work as well, like really sort of try to envision and place yourself and empathize with other species. So yeah, I think there's much more work that needs to be done to make a good assessment, a proper assessment on the conditions, on whether this charge of speciesism is really justified or whether there's more going on.
Mm-hmm. But would you say that being human makes us special in any way from an ethical perspective? That I mean, in some ways that we can separate ourselves because probably we have some sort of higher consciousness, or we are able to perform certain kinds of mental tasks or have certain mental experiences that probably all other animals lack, or at least there is strong evidence that they do. So do you think that there are good points out there on the speciesist side of this moral divide, let's say?
Right. I mean, this has of course been argued throughout the ages, that there's been this plea for human exceptionalism, and that humans have special capacities, and many of these pleas have failed, right? And that many good cases can be made that human individuals are not that special, and that really we are not very different from the individuals of other animal species in other relevant respects, like with respect to capacity for sentience and other sort of aspects that are taken to be morally relevant. So I think that if you look at human individuals, my own view is that we probably aren't all that special, at least if human individuals are taken in isolation. But if you look at the species level, something different might be going on, because I think this is not often argued or not even often taken up in these arguments, but I think a much more interesting and obvious difference emerges at the species level. So if you don't look at individuals but at species, and I think a good case can be made that we as a species are quite exceptional, right? I mean, just in terms of the very influence we exert at the moment on other species and on the planet, I mean, it's just obvious that we are very exceptional in that respect. And I think there might also be, perhaps, I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis to entertain, that there might also be sort of morally relevant respects in which, or we as a species are kind of exceptional. So we have this capacity for cumulative culture. We have amassed culture through evolutionary processes throughout history. We have engaged in processes of transmitting knowledge, transmitting cultural practices, technologies. We've inherited that from previous generations, and we've done so at a very different scale than other species have, and at accelerating pace over the last 10,000 years, and especially over the last 2 centuries. And I think that currently does set us as a species, really does set us apart in relevant respects. And so I'm not sure whether these are morally relevant respects, but I mean, you might entertain the proposition that, given that we lead these rich cultural lives right now, that also has implications for what human flourishing is. And perhaps it makes human flourishing also different in kind from flourishing in other species, and something more worth preserving in some sense. I mean, I'm not sure, so I'm sort of hesitant to really endorse this view, but I think it's a very interesting topic to explore in more detail, whether this sort of the way in which we have evolved as a species, whether this has brought about certain morally relevant differences, which might also subsequently reflect on our individual lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is all, I mean, and I think that this occurs with most of our ethical questions. I mean, it's always for us to decide what are the sorts of criteria that we include, right? Because there's no objective evaluator out there, and there are no moral truths to be found out there like we find other things in science, for example. So I mean, at the end of the day, even if these messes up with some people's minds, it is for us to decide what are the sort of criteria that we include when we evaluate different kinds of ethical questions, like like animal rights or something like that.
Exactly. Though let me qualify that by us, I don't mean like you and me. I mean really
Sure.
human society. It's really a social collective project of deciding, and of course that's a very messy, complicated project. But I think it's entirely right what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Hopster, let's end on that note. And before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
I do have a website which is hopelessly out of date, but I hope to be able to update it soon, which is my name, jeroenhopster.com. And I have profiles on academia and ResearchGate. And I mean, I've done several publications for a larger audience, but most of them are in Dutch, unfortunately. So yeah, I hope it's in given course that there will also be more publications for a larger audience in English.
Do you have Twitter or any kind of social media?
No, I don't. No, I think it's Twitter.
Okay, you don't use that. Okay. So, Dr. Hopster, I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting, all the topics that we covered up today. So, Dr. Hopster, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It has been a delight, and I wish you stay in good health and in good spirits, and thank you very much.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I have a lot of new patrons now, so I'm trying to get that 100 as soon as it's possible, to try to get also at 800 euros of monthly support. So let's see if we can get there. I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there, any amount you feel comfortable with. And otherwise, you can also make a one-time donation on PayPal, or also you can monthly subscribe on PayPal. I have all the links in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karin Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dan Bauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog. My producers is Arwebe, Rosie, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, and Matthew Lavender, and my executive producer, Michel Rugieski. Thank you for all.